Richard Georg Strauss was born on June 11, 1864 in Munich, Germany. His father Franz was principal horn at the court opera in Munich and a professor at the Royal Bavarian Music School. His mother Josephine was the daughter of a prosperous beer brewer in the city. He also had a younger sister named Berta. Richard began his musical studies at age 4, studying piano under August Tombo. Tombo was also a harpist at the Munich Court Orchestra, and Richard began attending rehearsals of the orchestra. He studied theory and orchestration under the orchestra's assistant conductor and violin under the orchestra's director Benno Walter in 1872. Richard's musical path was largely influenced by his father, especially his love for the horn. He was frequently joined by orphan composer Ludwig Thuil. Franz taught Richard the works of many of the German and Austrian masters, and began assisting him in composition starting in the 1870s. These early works were showcased to a youth orchestra conducted by Franz. Some early influences include Robert Schumann and Felix Mendelssohn. Richard would also hear many of the operas of Richard Wagner, including the Ring Cycle. Wagner's music was also influential on the young Strauss, but his father forbade him from studying as the family was skeptical of Wagner. It wasn't until he was 16 when Richard obtained the score to Tristan und Isolde. Richard then attended the Bayreuth Festival in 1882 to hear his father perform in the world premiere of Wagner's Parsifal. Surviving letters to his father and to Thuil show a negative impression of Wagner, but Richard would eventually regret his hostility towards Wagner later in his life. Some pieces written around this time include his first horn concerto and first symphony. In 1882, at age 18, Strauss wrote his violin concerto. He played a piano reduction of the concerto with his teacher Walter as the soloist. Strauss then began studying philosophy and art history at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, but he left after a year. After briefly studying in Berlin, he served as the assistant conductor of the Meiningen Court Orchestra under Hans von Bülow, learning conducting by observing his superior. Bülow was impressed by the young Strauss, considering him his greatest conducting mentor. Strauss gave his first major performance as a concert pianist, where he played Mozart's 24th Piano Concerto with his own cadenzas. After Bülow unexpectedly resigned in 1885, Strauss became the MCO's interim principal conductor. He organized the world premiere of Johannes Brahms' Fourth Symphony, which the composer conducted. Strauss would conduct his own Second Symphony for Brahms, with the senior composer saying this about the piece. Despite this, Brahms had left an impression on Strauss, referring to this period as his Brahmsschwärmerei. Some pieces which show the influence of Brahms include his piano quartet, Wanderer's Sturmlied, and Burlesque. In 1885, Strauss met German composer and violinist Alexander Ritter. Ritter had a large impact on the trajectory of Strauss's music, notably convincing him to abandon his more conservative style of composing and embrace the, quote, music of the future. Strauss and Ritter would have conversations on the writings of German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. These influences led to Strauss embracing the genre of tone poems. In 1886, he left his post at Meiningen and spent several weeks traveling throughout Italy, writing down descriptions of the sights he saw. The trip resulted in his first tone poem, Always Italian. The fourth movement incorporates the well-known Italian song Funiculi Funicola, written by Luigi Denza. Strauss was unaware that Denza had written the song only 6 years prior, as he believed it was a traditional Italian folk song. Denza sued Strauss and won, forcing the German composer to pay royalties. In any case, Strauss became the third conductor of the Bavarian State Opera after his trip to Italy. Ritter soon after moved to Munich, getting together with Strauss, Thuil, and conductor Anton Ziedel to discuss music, poetry, literature, and philosophy. Strauss didn't enjoy his time at the opera. Following the death of Ludwig II of Bavaria, his successor reduced financial support for the opera. This caused Strauss to have to stage lesser-known works which he thought were boring. In addition, his senior conductor was often sick, forcing him to conduct works he had never rehearsed. Strauss would find more enjoyable conducting work in other German cities. While in Leipzig in 1887, he met and became friends with Austrian composer Gustav Mahler. That same year, he met soprano Pauline de Anna. She was a student at Munich Conservatory, but soon switched to private lessons with Strauss. Strauss soon left the Bavarian State Opera and was appointed Kapellmeister to Charles Alexander, Grand Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach. He would then write his next two tone poems, Macbeth and Don Juan, in 1888, the latter piece premiering in Weimar the following year. Don Juan brought Strauss international fame and terror to all orchestral violinists. In 1889, he wrote Toten Verklärung, which premiered at a festival in Eisenach. It was another successful work for Strauss, with French music critic Romain Rolland calling it, quote, one of the most moving works of Strauss, and that which is constructed with the noblest utility. Don Juan and Toten Verklärung established him as a leading modernist composer. Strauss's conducting career was also beginning to take off. He served as assistant conductor of the Bayreuth Festival, becoming lifelong friends with Wagner's second wife Cosima. He would also conduct Wagner's Tannhäuser with Pauline as the lead female role. Soon after, in 1894, Strauss and Pauline were married. Although Pauline was known for being outspoken and quick to anger, the marriage was a happy one. They had a son named Franz 3 years later. Strauss then wrote his first opera Guntram in 1893. It received mixed reviews when it was staged in Weimar and poor reviews in Munich, Strauss's first major failure. Despite this, he served as principal conductor for the Berlin Philharmonic for the 1894-95 season. From 1895 to 1898, Strauss wrote 4 more tone poems. The first was still Eulenspiegels lustige Streiche, which premiered in Cologne, conducted by Franz Wüllner. This piece features a famous horn solo at the beginning, and there's an interesting story about it. When Strauss gave the sheet music to his principal horn, he replied that he wasn't able to play it. Strauss responded by saying the horn player himself gave him the idea for it. The next tone poem written, arguably his most famous work, was also Sprach Zarathustra, based on the novel of the same name by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Strauss himself conducted the premiere in Frankfurt. The piece has become quite well known in popular culture, most famously being used as the opening of Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. The next tone poem written was Don Quixote, a theme and variations for solo cello and orchestra. It premiered in Cologne with Friedrich Grützmacher as the soloist. The last tone poem in this series is Ein Heldenleben. Despite its dedication to the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra, it was actually premiered by the Frankfurt Opera House and Museum's Orchestra, with the composer conducting. The piece was not well received, with one critic calling it, quote, as revolting a picture of this revolting man as one might ever encounter. It would eventually become standard repertoire, with the opening melody terrorizing orchestral cellists to this day. In 1898, Strauss became principal conductor of the Berlin State Opera. At this point in his career, he was in constant demand internationally as a guest conductor. He became president of the General German Music Association in 1901, as well as a leader of the Berlin Musicians Association. Strauss would use these posts to promote contemporary German composers. His works were also becoming increasingly popular, with the Vienna Philharmonic being the first major orchestra to program a concert entirely of his music. There were even festivals dedicated to Strauss's music in London and Heidelberg. The latter city would be the premiere of his cantata Tyler Fair, written in 1903. The following year, Strauss went on tour through North America for the first time. He conducted the premiere of his tone poem Sinfonia Domestica at Carnegie Hall in New York City. While in the US, Strauss worked on his opera Salome, which premiered in Dresden in 1905. It was the greatest success in his career up to that point. Mahler called the opera, quote, a live volcano, a subterranean fire, while French composer Maurice Ravel simply called it, quote, stupendous. Strauss would continue writing operas, including Elektra in 1909 and Der Rosenkavalier in 1911. The latter opera is considered his magnum opus. Not long after, World War I broke out in Europe. Strauss was invited to sign the Manifesto of the 93, a proclamation by prominent Germans in support of the German war effort. Strauss refused to sign the manifesto, writing in his diary, quote, declarations about war and politics are not fitting for an artist, who must give attention to his creations and his works. In the meantime, Strauss wrote his final tone poem Eine Alpensymphonie in 1915, which depicts the climbing of a mountain in the Alps. The piece calls for an enormous orchestra, including 16 off-stage brass instruments. Strauss himself conducted the premiere in Berlin. Despite the mixed reviews from audiences, he was quite happy with how it turned out. He continued composing and conducting during the war, serving as principal conductor of the Vienna State Opera for 5 years. In 1920, Strauss co-founded the Salzburg Festival, along with theater and film director Max Reinhardt. He then wrote Intermezzo in 1924, which successfully premiered at the Semper Opera in Dresden. In 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party took over Germany. Strauss, who was 68 at the time, was initially interested in cooperating with the Nazis, hoping they would promote German art and culture, especially since Hitler was a noted fan of Wagner. In any case, Strauss soon abandoned the idea of cooperation. He never joined the Nazi Party and avoided the standard Nazi greeting. Strauss would write in his diary, quote, I consider the Streicher Goebbels Jew baiting as a disgrace to German honor, and evidence of incompetence, the basest weapon of untalented, lazy mediocrity against a higher intelligence and greater talent. Joseph Goebbels, chief propagandist of the Nazi Party, maintained a cordiality with the composer for a while, but would call the composer a, quote, decadent neurotic in his diary. Without any prior consultation, Strauss was appointed president of the Reichsmusikkammer. He only accepted the position so that he could, quote, do some good and prevent worse misfortunes. He would also write to his family saying, quote, I made music under the Kaiser and under Ebert. I'll survive under this one as well.
Man, that's tough.
Strauss would write his orchestral work Das Backline, dedicating it to Goebbels in order to gain some influence in extending German copyright law, although Strauss personally disliked Goebbels. Italian conductor Arturo Toscanini resigned from his post as director of the Bayreuth Festival in protest of the Nazi regime, with Strauss replacing him. Toscanini will also comment on Strauss's position in the Reichsmusikkammer, saying, quote, to Strauss the composer, I take off my hat. To Strauss the man, I put it back on again. Despite his position in the government, Strauss ignored bans on performances of various composers, including Mahler and Mendelssohn, both of whom were Jewish, and Debussy, who married a Jew. In addition, he wrote his comic opera Die Schweigsame Frau in 1935, with his Jewish friend Stefan Zweig as the librettist. Strauss insisted on Zweig's name appearing on the program, much to the ire of the Nazis, who eventually banned the work after only 3 performances. Strauss then wrote this in a letter to Zweig, which was intercepted by the Gestapo and given to Hitler. Strauss was then dismissed from his position in the Reichsmusikkammer, although his Olympic hymn was used in the infamous 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin. Due to Zweig being Jewish, Strauss was no longer able to work with him, and began working with Joseph Gregor instead. They collaborated on a one-act opera written as a subtle critique of the Nazi regime. Following the outbreak of World War II, opera productions would come to a halt. Despite this, he wrote his last 2 operas, Die Liebe der Danae and Capriccio. Strauss's relationship with the Nazi regime was largely motivated by his need to protect his family. His daughter-in-law Alice was Jewish, as were his 2 grandsons. Strauss used his connections and influence to keep them from being sent to a concentration camp. However, Alice was placed under house arrest in the Bavarian town of Garmisch-Partenkirchen in 1938. Alice's mother was safe in Lucerne, Switzerland, but Strauss would write letters to the SS pleading for the release of her children, which were ignored. Additionally, Strauss drove to the Theresienstadt concentration camp to argue for the release of Alice's grandmother, but to no avail. Tragically, she and other relatives were killed in the camp. In 1942, Strauss moved to Vienna to put his family under the protection of a Nazi, surprisingly. This would still not be enough to keep his family safe, as in early 1944, Strauss's son and daughter-in-law would be abducted by the Gestapo and imprisoned for 2 nights. Strauss's intervention would once again save his family, taking them back to Garmisch where they remained under house arrest for the rest of the war. Amidst the ongoing war and the chaos with his family, Strauss would write Metamorphosen for strings in 1945, the inspiration for the piece coming from a poem by Goethe. The piece is written during the darkest days of the war, and expresses the composer's mourning of the destruction of German culture. Metamorphosen is widely regarded as a masterpiece of string repertoire. In April of 1945, American soldiers arrived at Strauss's estate in Garmisch. Strauss ascended the staircase and would introduce himself to them. The lieutenant, who was also a musician, nodded in recognition and placed an off-limits sign on the lawn to protect the composer. Additionally, one of the American soldiers was an oboist and knew of Strauss's oboe writing for orchestra. He asked the composer if he could write an oboe concerto. Strauss initially said no, but would eventually write his oboe concerto 6 months later. It premiered in Zurich, Switzerland with Marcel Salier as a soloist. By the time the war in Europe ended, Strauss wrote in his diary, quote, "The most terrible period of human history is at an end, the 12-year reign of bestiality, ignorance, and anti-culture under the greatest criminals, during which Germany's 2,000 years of cultural evolution met its doom." The term Indian Summer is used as a metaphor for Strauss's creativity from 1942 to his death, with the war bringing Strauss into focus despite his age. Some pieces written around this time include his second horn concerto, Japanische Festmusik, and his second sonatina. Strauss's bank accounts had been frozen after the war, with many of his assets seized by American forces. He moved to Switzerland in late 1945, living in hotels outside of Zurich and the town of Montreux. He then worked with musicologist Willy Schuh on his biography. Short on money, Strauss made a 3-week tour to London in 1947, conducting several of his works and attending BBC staging of Elektra. The trip was successful, providing him with much needed money. A year later, Strauss wrote his Vier letzte Lieder, which deals with the subject of death. The last song ends with the line, "Ich dies etwa der Tod?" He would also be cleared of any wrongdoing in a denazification trial in mid-1948. Strauss was then hospitalized for several weeks after receiving bladder surgery, and his health would rapidly decline. He conducted his last performance at the Prince Regent Theater in Munich on his 85th birthday. He then suffered a heart attack 2 months later. Finally, on December 8, 1949, Richard Strauss died of kidney failure in his sleep in Garmisch. While on his deathbed, he would say to his daughter-in-law, quote, "Dying is just like compose it in Tod und Verklärung." Sir George Solti directed the orchestra at Strauss's burial. During the performance of the famous trio from Der Rosenkavalier, Solti described how the singers, quote, "broke down in tears and dropped out of the ensemble, but they recovered themselves and we all ended together." Pauline died in 1950. Strauss is noted for pioneering subtleties of orchestration and his advanced harmonic style. His early works were written mostly for solo instruments and chamber ensembles with a conservative harmonic style. By 1890, his focus had shifted to large-scale orchestral works and operas. As mentioned before, Ritter convinced Strauss to abandon his conservatism in favor of tone poems, with Don Juan being widely regarded as the first piece displaying his musical maturity. In his book Richard Strauss, Man, Music, Enigma, English music critic Michael Kennedy argues, quote, "No orchestra could exist without his tone poems, written to celebrate the glories of post-Wagnerian symphony orchestra." Strauss's operas Salome and Elektra started turning towards dissonance, most evident in the Elektra chord. Think of it like Strauss's version of the Tristan and Petrushka chords. Strauss's later works used a more lush, melodic style based on Wagnerian chromaticism. He shifted away from dissonance and incorporated more virtuosity in his orchestral writing. In addition to writing for orchestra, Strauss was also a prolific lieder composer, often writing with his wife's voice in mind. His lieder have always been popular among audiences and musicians, with many musicologists considering them as masterpieces. Of course, Strauss was also a great conductor, making numerous recordings of German and Austrian composers. Our old friend Harold C. Schoenberg would say that Strauss was a very fine conductor, but often put little effort into his recordings. Schoenberg argues that the second and last movements of his recording of Beethoven's 7th Symphony were too fast, and would say his recording of Mozart's 4th Symphony had, quote, no force, no charm, no inflection, with a metronomic rigidity. According to musicologist Hugo Shirley, Strauss was seen as a conservative, backwards-looking composer until the 1980s. Fortunately, re-examination and new research of Strauss solidified him as a modernist, albeit while revering tonality and lush orchestration. Countless composers have been influenced by Strauss, including Bartók and Schoenberg, both of whom I've made videos on, Anton Webern, Sir Edward Elgar, Benjamin Britten, as well as contemporary composers John Adams and John Corigliano. Strauss's music has also played a role in the development of mid-20th century film music. Film composers influenced by Strauss include Max Steiner, Erich Wolfgang Korngold, Alfred Newman, and a relatively unknown composer by the name of John Williams I've heard is pretty good. Historian Timothy E. Scheuer would say of Strauss's influence, quote, the elements of post-late romantic music that had the greatest impact on scoring are its lush sound, expanded harmonic language, chromaticism, user-programmed music, and use of leitmotifs. Hollywood composers found the post-romantic idiom compatible with their efforts in scoring film. To say that Strauss had a massive impact on the world of music is a massive understatement. His music continues to be widely performed and celebrated to this day, and he's been solidified as one of the greatest German composers in history. Other interesting facts about Strauss include him receiving multiple awards, including the Legion d'honneur. He was featured on Time magazine twice, and he has an asteroid and a type of rose named after him.